Rob Nateson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Steph.
President Biden over the weekend called the Supreme Court extremist. Now, you said in a recent op-ed for the Epoch Times that the Supreme Court is actually no longer conservative and it's no longer liberal. Could you explain what that means?
Sure. We have not had a conservative activist on the court in the sense that we have three liberal activists on the court since 1941, when Justice James McReynolds retired. What we have among the six-justice majority are a collection of philosophies. There's originalism, there's respect for precedent, there's what is sometimes called judicial minimalism, but there's no clear conservative thread. As for the charge that the court is being extremist, I think that's more an indication of where those people who are making those charges are coming from themselves, that they may be the extremists, and therefore they inaccurately perceive the court that way. And we could discuss that if you like.
Yes, in your op-ed, you pointed to a trend in the Supreme Court's decisions in previous terms, saying that they've overstepped their bounds in some ways of the traditional role of the Supreme Court justices. And you call it liberal judicial activism. Could you explain how that happened and what it means?
Well, during the 20th century, roughly from about 1940 to 1990, a majority of the court consisted of people who had very liberal ideologies, and they tended to import those ideologies into the Constitution, whether the Constitution really stood for them or not. That ended eventually in part, but until this term, the Supreme Court continued to apply many of the precedents that had been adopted by liberal courts during its most liberal era. It wasn't until this term that you saw a major liberal precedent being overturned, that is to say, Roe versus Wade, and the court began to really edge in a direction other than or away from the jurisprudence that was created in this very liberal activist time. I think a lot of the complaints about the court are not really because the court has been conservative. The complaints are from people who want the court to continue to be a liberal activist court.
And if this trend does continue with this type of ruling, how do you see that affecting the nation?
Well, I think the big unanswered question is whether the court is willing to tackle a big unanswered question, and that is whether Congress has the power to do all the things that Congress purports to do. This term, the court issued a few decisions that curb the bureaucracy somewhat. So, for example, in the case of West Virginia versus Environmental Protection Agency, the court said that the Environmental Protection Agency can't go ahead and restructure the entire energy market of the United States without the approval of Congress. But a more serious question is, does Congress really have the power to restructure the entire energy market of the country? Or does the Constitution's limits on federal power still hold? We'll see if future courts or future terms are willing to address that issue.
And how does this discussion apply to the issues that people are discussing around recent contentious rulings, such as Roe v. Wade?
Well, Roe versus Wade is a good example, and I wrote on this issue for the Epoch Times. The progressive left has a strong political interest in keeping the issue of abortion as a federal issue. If this issue is moved to the states for various reasons, that's a big loss for them. It works well for them as a federal issue. And so that's why you see the demonstrations, why you also see the suggestion that Congress should intervene with its own regulation of abortion. I don't think that's going to prevail. I think it probably will move back to the states, and then people can, instead of slugging it out against each other in court, they can reason together in the state legislatures about what makes the most sense with respect to abortion policy.
And what do you think can be done moving forward to reach a mutual understanding on the court's intended purpose and to protect that purpose?
That's the role of constitutional education. And when you see the kind of outroar that you saw in the wake of the overturning of Roe versus Wade, it's an indication that our education system has failed to educate people about the Constitution and about the proper role of courts. And so that's one reason why I write a column for the Epoch Times. It's one reason I'm engaged in constitutional education, because people need to know that the rule of law requires there be a set of rules. You may not always agree with them. If you want to change them, you go to the legislature, but you don't blame the court for applying the rules that it's supposed to apply. So that's the task of us educators, is to go before the American public and to explain what the public schools apparently are not explaining, and that's the role of the rule of law and of the Constitution in our system.
Constitutional scholar Rob Nateson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Steph.